In today's world, faith isn't about easy answers. Faith is about asking hard questions, following your curiosity, making a difference. At the Candler Foundry, we believe in a world in which you can consider new perspectives, find your purpose, reimagine what's possible. When we come together to learn, grow, explore, belong.
Hello, friends, and welcome to the third and final Summer Book Series webinar brought to you by the Candler Foundry. This is our publications webinar, where normally we're covering theological books or books on religion and faith written by Candler community members. But over this summer, it's been my pleasure to be with you as we've gone through some beach reads, looking at different works of fiction and drawing out biblical and theological motifs and themes, and just having a little bit of fun. Now, today, we will be discussing Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I hope you have all been prepared, if not having read the novel, at least being familiar with the story, because I promise you it's a little different than film adaptations. Before we start, I want to invite you to drop any of your questions and comments in the chat so that me and my guest will be able to answer them or bring up thoughts and comments that you have as topics for us to discuss. So please feel free at any time to put those in, and we will get to those as soon as we can. Now I'd like to invite my guest to come out. This is Sergio Chois. He is one of our Candler Foundry Fellows, an MTS student here at Candler, and I'm very pleased to say my friend. So Sergio, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And I was talking about this with you earlier, but for those of you that are in the Atlanta area, you'll know that it's a great day for us to talk about this because it's a dark and stormy day. Which we don't normally get in early August in Atlanta. So I like to think of it as some kind of a divine gift.
There you go.
For us today. Sergio is in Florida, where I'm sure it's quite sunny.
Yeah, but once it hits August for me, it's spooky season. And so regardless of what the weather is, it's all in the mind.
Gotcha. So Sergio, I know that you've read this book before and you've just now read it again. So what were some of the biblical or theological themes or motifs that stood out to you this time? Because you can't swing a dead cat and not hit a biblical or theological motif in Frankenstein.
Sure. We talked about it briefly off air, but you can go in so many avenues, some very blatant and some implicit. But I think for me, especially with the conversation of AI and what we as a people group can create and what happens to our creation and the ethics that arise from it, that's what's most pertinent to me, especially when it comes to Victor's reasoning for wanting to do what he does, right? He seeks after creating life because that's the next progression for him. It's not wealth that motivates him, it's glory and the next step in the scientific development.
Mm-hmm. You know what? I know this is going to sound so out of touch. The AI part didn't even occur to me. But you're right. That is one of the conversations that we're having in the public sphere, we're having in churches, is what does it mean to create something and be responsible for it?
Sure. Like we have an animated life, but we sure have made leaps and bounds to create some form of artificial life.
Mm-hmm. And how far ahead do we need to think to find out what parameters need to be there in place, or what things we have to consider when we're creating something that has the potential to either do great good or great damage, which almost all great inventions can do both.
Right.
Nearly everything can be used in that way. So I think it's interesting because it doesn't seem in the story like Victor really considered what would happen afterwards. Like,
Right.
the whole point was just making it alive. It wasn't actually giving life, like a life, to this inanimate being, which I think is interesting. Like, did you not consider that as soon as you brought it to life, it'd be alive? Like, it's like, as soon as it's alive, he's like, oh my gosh, look at what happened. I'm like, well, what did you think
Right.
was
Right when you start to actually have to do the work of being a creator, it kind of like hits him right in the face, and he's kind of left dumbfounded.
Mhm. And then he becomes basically like a deadbeat dad.
Right.
Like, he runs out of the house as soon as he brings the creature to life, and then it sort of wanders off to try to figure out life on its own. And he just spends all of his time like holed up in his house, like in fits and fevers. And I'm like, I guess I'm thinking, dude, creation isn't just the making of it, but the sustaining of it. And it
Right.
seems like that's the part that he just never accounted for.
Sure. And I guess in that regard, I guess another one of the themes that really struck out to me in relation theologically has to do with the nature of the creation in relation to the creator, right? So
Mhm.
in Frankenstein, who is at fault for the monster being the way that he is? Is it
Mhm.
Victor's fault, or is it the ebbs and flows of life that leads the monster to be who he is? And for me, like, I don't know, seeing just the calamity that's happening in the world right now, I don't know. I wrestle with that to say that I believe that God is good, but to
Mhm.
see the world in such turmoil, how much is that a reflection of me, and how much of that is a reflection of God? Which I know is can be quite sacrilegious to speak out, but in some ways, I resonate with that wrestling tension that the book is trying to present in this story.
Mhm. Yeah. Now, I do think that Shelley is trying to, she's using Victor as like a foil for God, because
Sure, yeah,
the monster, which is hilarious that in the film adaptations he's like monosyllabic, and this is like the most, he's like far more eloquent.
totally articulate.
I was just like, I don't know, maybe he should be the doctor. But what I find interesting is that the monster will refer to like the works that God did. Like, God
Mm,
animated human beings and then gave them community.
yeah,
God made humans, but then made a mate for the human that he had made. That God placed them in a garden. Like, there's all of these things. Like, it, apparently the creation stories that she's working with are telling her that there's like a certain welcome package, right, that creatures get from their creator.
mm,
And the monster actually like explicitly says, you gave me none of these things.
right.
You didn't clothe me, you didn't offer me food, you didn't teach me how to do anything, you didn't give me any society, any relationship, and you were yourself absent completely, and didn't desire relationship. So it's almost like she's setting him up against and comparing him to God. But then, like you said, we have to take it one step further and say, if we're made in this God's image, and this is the state of the world, and like we have to ask ourselves, where is God at work, and where are we at work, and how are we at work like God? Like, all those questions like naturally come from that.
Sure. And it almost seems as though the book addresses that in the sense that the monster even pleads for that. That's his ultimatum, right? He comes to Victor at one point and it's like, I want you to create me a mate, and we're gonna, have a great life in South America. That's what we're going to do. It's almost like, right, he's trying to retroactively do what Victor should have done at the beginning. And in that sense, right, Victor is more in line with the deistic kind of way of looking at God, that God is some kind of clockmaker and he kind of just sets it off and sees what happens, but he's passive in the background.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I've heard people make the argument that the creature doesn't become a monster until Victor kills the mate and destroys the mate, which I mean, I certainly see it.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think it's interesting that creation and community are like that for in this story are you can't separate them. And to be like a creature in the fullest sense is also to be in a created community.
That's
Um,
yeah.
and that's when like even though the creature went through all these hardships and all of this like loneliness and all of this, it wasn't until like true community is completely and utterly denied him that's when everything goes off the rails, which I just find very interesting considering when Shelley's writing this and who she's writing this with.
Mm.
In the throes of romanticism on the European continent, that's highly individualistic. Capitalism is climbing, and I think it's interesting that it's at this moment she keeps coming back to these themes of, none of those actual like material things like having food and shelter and water, none of those things satisfy without community. And I just find that interesting. Like the creature can procure all those things and he becomes a monster not having community. And I just find that interesting that at this
Yeah.
particular time, being married to one of the great romantic poets, and having like a father steeped in, romantic philosophy, that she's like, no, no, it's not just about individuals' internal life and happiness and flourishing. This
Sure.
takes others. Like,
Yeah.
end of story, which I find interesting.
Yeah, even the monster craves it, right? In
Mhm.
that the only way that he's able to flourish is in that found family that he encounters in that little cabin, right? Like
Mhm.
that's where he really flourishes and finds out, like, oh, I learned to read. I learned the poets. I learned what it was to have an argument amongst two people and what love is, and that was only possible when sharing the space with another created entity.
Mhm. But yet he was still only an observer, um,
Right.
and wasn't and so this notion of he's living this completely individualist life. Like he has access to learning and to music and to food and shelter and safety, and yet the barrier between him and having authentic relationship, it isn't sustainable. That kind of solitary or complete self containment is not sustainable for him.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I think that having brought up AI earlier, I think that right there is a very pertinent like theme in the digital age. Like, what does it mean to be in community and to have barriers? Like you and I are talking over a screen and we're in community, but is that different? Does it serve the same needs as actually being in the same space? Like these kind of questions about what does individual and community look like really, I think, applies to our current situation.
And now that you say that, I come to mind because when we say like we're meeting virtually, we're saying that because I'm here and you are there, not necessarily that we're meeting through technological means. But that's what we mean when we say it most of the time.
Mhm.
And in that sense, Frankenstein is having a virtual experience with this
Yes.
family that he meets in the cabin, right? And what he really seeks after is embodied community. And that's what he's being denied from when he meets them and is, denied any sense of I guess we can say humanity, even though, he's a cobbled up piece of it. Regardless, that's what he's striving after, and that's what's being denied of him. And so in the digital age, I think of what does it mean for even as a church to have online gatherings versus embodied live gatherings, whether or not you're increasing your congregation size, what have you, whatever metrics you're trying to measure your spiritual effectiveness. Are we losing something by stripping away our corporeality?
Mhm. Or I hear a lot of people, and I think it's fair, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that people say, well, I don't resonate with people in my immediate community, or like folks in the LGBTQ
Yeah.
community saying that going online and finding communities of people in various spaces was really life giving. But at the same time, there's a barrier to being able to have interaction in the same way. And I think the monster tries to do this. Like, he goes out and gathers wood for them and leaves it as a gift, and he keeps trying to supply them with things. And so like there is interaction, but there's also still not a full knowing. They know someone is doing this, and he knows them in certain ways as they appear to him in front of him, but there's still some barrier or some fence that they may be known to him, but he needs to be known to them. And he feels that desire to be known, to be seen. And he even talks about like how grotesque his features are, and like to have someone willing to overlook that and to see me, you know, like, which I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like, this book aged well.
Yes.
You know, like, these are still very
a classic.
Yeah,
Classic.
Exactly. And I think that that's one of those things in digital relationships that, while I think it definitely overcomes some barriers, there's always that final, you know, sort of barrier of, am I known to you the way I'm known to me?
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing the creature's after. And I think that's the thing that as we're creating community, you know, like you said, in churches and schools and neighborhoods and things like this, it's not just, do I know you, but am I known to you? Do you know me as I know me?
Yeah. You just remind me of the quote from the late Tim Keller. He once said that to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. But to be known and not loved is our greatest fear.
Yes. Which, I mean, the monster burns their house down. I mean, like, that was this response to being rejected, to being finally seen, and to being not loved and indeed feared. Like, that was like it's so funny. Like I said, there's so many places where people are like, oh, this is the moment the creature becomes a monster. And it's like all these places. And I'm like, well, yeah, but they're all based on other people treating him poorly. Like, I kind of feel like, I don't know, like, that seems kind of reasonable.
Right. I just got reminded of one of the quotes in the book that I love, in that kind of turn, right? When he's not accepted, the monster says, if I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
No, I love it. It's so good. But in that regard as well, I guess another thing that really struck out to me is in terms of a biblical relation, has to do with the monster's progression as it relates to knowledge. So it's very proverbial, or I guess in this sense more ecclesiastical, in the sense of the book of Ecclesiastes, where with greater wisdom comes greater sorrow. The monster has the exact same experience. I'm trying to find the quote exactly verbatim, but he has a similar discovery where the more that he learns and develops from this family, the more that he comes into realization of how much of a stark difference himself is to the outside world.
Yes. And it's interesting because he says, I feel nothing but kindness and love. Like, I desire only the good. And to know that there are people that are just desirous of, you know, greed or hate or violence is startling to him, but you can also tell it unsettles him. And that's one of the things that I think maybe is one of those steps that finally provokes him. Like, oh, okay, like, if my love isn't acceptable, there's all these other obvious ways one can live in the world that he's learned. So you're right. There's also the, what do we do with knowledge?
Yeah, there's a chapter 11. I found it. I cannot describe to you the agony that these reflections inflicted upon me. I tried to dispel them, but sorrow only increased with knowledge. And in my note, I literally wrote, okay, Solomon, that's it. Heard that one before.
Yeah. Well, and this gets me back to one of the parts that I am fascinated by. And I don't know if it was going through the PhD process, but Victor, in the process of becoming Dr. Frankenstein, it's interesting. He's trying to create this being, right? And he says that he ends up, Victor, looking like emaciated, and his eyes are sunken and hollow. Like, let's just be real. Victor's the actual monster here.
Yeah.
hands down. And he's like, I didn't eat or sleep or go outside. And I think back to like that, the creation stories that Shelley is playing off of. And what does God do? He takes a Sabbath.
Right.
Part of creating and using knowledge in a way that's beneficial and healthy and honestly more fun is, well, why the heck weren't you going outside? Why didn't you meet up with friends? Why didn't you hear other perspectives? That might have staved off some of this catastrophe. And I think, gosh, that's how a lot of people wrote their dissertations. You know,
Frankenstein was one giant allegory for the PhD process.
And I was just like, I don't know, like, I'm not sure how healthy the knowledge you produce is when you produce it in unhealthy ways.
Right.
And I think it's interesting that before Victor ever subjects this creature to this life starved of community and love and compassion, what does he do? It says he didn't see his family for like 6 years or something crazy like that. And they're like, what, 50 miles away? Like, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Like, and so I'm like, that's another part of this. Like, what is the good of knowledge without the fullness of life? What's the good of, like you said, glory and creation without also enjoyment and pleasure? And I think that these are still, particularly in academia, still issues that we need to work out.
Yeah.
There can't be a happy ending to an unhappy journey.
Sure.
You know, like it matters how you come to this thing. And I think that before we even get to the creature, we see this problem in Victor himself.
Yeah. And I guess then there's the stark contrast between Frankenstein and the Genesis creation story, right? In that in God's creation of every facet of the created order, he looks at it and reflects upon it and says that it is good, ultimately culminating with humanity saying that it is very good, right? Kind of putting it as the pinnacle of all creation. But the moment that Victor finishes his work, he's in disgust of it, which I don't know what to do with all that much. Is that more indicative of the way that Victor views what he's done or what the creature is?
Okay, so I have my own take on this, and this might be a stretch, but I'm thinking like it reminded me, I don't think that necessarily Shelley is referring to the story, but it reminded me of the story of David's son that rapes his sister Tamar.
Yeah.
That he desired her so greatly that it was consuming his very body. Like he was ill. He wanted to possess her. And as soon as he rapes her, he's disgusted with her and casts her away.
Right.
And I was just like, that's kind of what this reminded me of, how he was like talking about this dogged pursuit, you know, this, he even refers to it as like mania, like this craze of wanting to do this and being utterly consumed with it. And then as soon as it's consummated, this thing is now like, you know, disgusting and repulsive to him. And I was just like, the two things that it brought up for me is the nature of sin, you know, and being consumed with something, but that ultimately, once you look at it, like, I don't want to say objectively, but you look at it from the perspective of what happens next, all of a sudden, like it's very clear what went awry. But also it made me think about like addiction. And that this is very much a cycle of addiction, you know, of the desire for something. And then as soon as it's done, like this intense, like shame or loathing or repulsion. And I was just like, man, I don't know why Victor needed to make someone else. He needed to work on himself first. I'm like, I think before you go like making another person, you need to like do a little introspection.
Yeah. Therapy would have been great in 1818. It would have been great.
Yeah. And so I'm just really like interested because Victor is not a terribly reliable narrator, because at the end he talks about, before this happened, I was great. I was fine. I was enjoying my life and everything was wonderful. I'm like, well, what happened? I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure you can go to being fully healthy and enjoying life and having moderate pursuits to all of a sudden just going overnight. Was it the fact that he was separated from his family?
Sure, that he's separated from his community.
This loneliness produced this effect, which is exactly what happens to the creature he creates. So I know it might be a stretch, but that was kind of how I saw it.
Right. And in theological terms, this is what some people like to say, that in the sense that Christ is the most human of us, right? In the sense that we do not fully understand what it is to be truly human, to be in full community, being loved and known by those around us and with God. And in that sense, right, Shelley could be in a sense saying that to be a monster, to be truly monstrous, is to be separated from community, to be separated from other humans.
Yes. Well, and the very word monster is this notion of other, of something that doesn't belong in any particular category. That's what makes something monstrous. And what's actually really interesting, Sergio, is there's actually, I can't remember if it's a paper or a whole book, but it makes the argument that Jesus in the Gospel of John is a monster, that he doesn't belong in any particular community.
Sure.
And that's why there is this huge pushback. Because he's monstrous, and that's why he's put outside. Like, you don't fit this group, you don't fit this group, you don't fit fully divine. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus isn't fully divine. I don't want to get emails, folks. What I'm saying is that the concept of divine to the people of that time, that you're not a god, you can't be the God. Again, not saying that that's the case John makes, but you also aren't interacting and in the same way that humans are. And so the reason for the repulsion to Jesus is that he is, in relation to them, he is a monster to them. And so monster can only mean in relation, like, because it's only you, that's monstrous to me. Whereas if Victor had made the mate for the creature, that wouldn't have been monster to the creature. Sure. That would have been like.
In that sense, then, for the example of that family in the cabin, they are just as much culpable of creating the monster that Victor is. Because if Victor doesn't create community for the monster to have, then the family within that cabin doesn't allow to be a safe haven for community for the other. And so there has to be something to be said, at least from what I'm gathering with what you're saying, is that monstrosity can also be something that is forced upon other people if we other them.
Yes. Yes. Which is interesting that Victor could other the creature when he made him. Like, right. And especially if we think about those Genesis stories, the fact that the creation is in some sense the image of, right, the reflection of the creator, which is again why I saw like the creature's trajectory is very much what I think Frankenstein's trajectory was at the beginning, and how the loneliness, the separation, all of these things produced like this this violence. Like what Victor does, he even describes as the violence performed on like these dead bodies and his, you know, stealthy nighttime. And he was like, I would become disgusted with what I was doing. I'm like, it's violence. You know, there's mutilation going on. And so it's interesting that pattern of the creator is expressed in the creation. But it's interesting that the creator, in essence, chose to make its creation other rather than to make it like. Right. Because, well, if Victor had just like stuck around and like, oh, I made you, I should probably give you some clothes and teach you to talk. Like, I swear, like I said, the creature could have like gone on to be like a philosophy professor, or you know, we've all seen Young Frankenstein. He might be
he's reading Milton like it's nothing. He's like, yeah.
So I'm just like, it's interesting that it was by withholding that the love and care of the creator that the creator others and makes the creature a monster. So
in that sense, if going on the idea of humanity being the image of God, in that sense, could we see Victor's, you know, repulsion at his first sight of the creation when it's brought into life? Is that more indicative of what the monster is, or what that reflects as him as creator?
Honestly, I would say him as creator, because he's immediately. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, he's repulsed by himself, the monstrosity of himself, not so much the being that is in front of him. Yep. So good.
Not to mention, what the heck? Like, if you really thought this being was just terrible and you just let him run off and like wreak havoc on other people. I'm like, dude, like in every sense of the word, this is an irresponsible creator. Like
Right.
irresponsible not only to the creation, but to everybody else. And I think it's really interesting that it's only after he kills everyone that Victor loves, Victor's like, all right, I think I'm going to end his life. I'm like,
Yeah,
I'm not.
I think I should take things in my own hands,
If you were going to do that, why would you let this creature run around and like make itself miserable? And I'm like, this is very backwards. There was, again, for Victor, this was poor planning. Just.
And in that regard, again, to bring up questions of theodicy that I mentioned at the start, just to say that like we could give Victor a break because he's a finite being. He can't literally be in all places. He's not this all-powerful being, but God is. And so to see the creation kind of wreak havoc upon itself, that is one of the things I wrestle with, right? What does that mean for the creator to how is the creator at work in the world through his creation as well?
That's a really good question. And it's interesting because like the first part of Victor's relationship with the creature is him running away from the creature. And the second part is him pursuing the creature, which I think is interesting because we do get this idea throughout the biblical text of God pursuing like humans, right? And pursuing relationship. But there's also plenty of biblical examples of the creation, like calling on God in absence, like the lament Psalms, and even Jesus on the cross, in Mark's gospel, where are you and why are we here? Like this, in this manner. And so it's interesting that we have both of these, the creator like absent and also the creator in pursuit. Of course, Victor is pursuing the creature to kill it, so that's different, but it is interesting.
I guess this is me now asking you from your New Testament perspective, then what is the gravitas in light of what we're talking about, Frankenstein, for the biblical story of God becoming the creation, right? The creator becoming a piece of the creation.
I'm not sure. What do you mean, like New Testament wise?
Well, just in your New Testament expertise of Jesus being the incarnate God, right? What is the real impact? Like, what are we getting at with Shelley's interpretation, or not her interpretation, but the story of Victor first being repelled from his creation, right? Running away from it and pursuing it to destroy it. But in the biblical account, we have God coming down as human to save it, not to destroy it.
Well, again, I think it goes back to the hypothesis about John's gospel. Now that you mentioned like Jesus being incarnate, and in those first verses in the Gospel of John, we hear like he came unto his own and his own rejected him. Mm-hmm. That being one of these, like, just like the creature, being rejected from your own creator or from the people that you have found kinship with, that like the family, he's lived with them. He is, in a sense, just like Jesus dwelled among them and they received him not, and I wonder if there's this, is this divine empathy, that God can be simultaneously the creator, and also understand being the monster, can understand being the created and the creator, but also understand both sides of creation, of being God's good creation and also being understood as, Jesus was anathema. He was cursed. He was, hung on a wooden stake. Like, you don't get much more cursed than that. Yeah. So that's like the fullest, broadest identity you can have, being both God and human, being both creator and created, and being as it within the human span, the ultimate good creation, ultimate good human being, and yet the most spurned monster. So I think like and I realized I would never let my students do this, but I would think about Paul talking about this is Jesus gathering up all in all, right? That Jesus, by being all of these things, all of these expressions of both God and humanity, created, this is in a sense a gathering up. Like there is nothing, there is no identity, there is no relationship or understanding that he cannot and does not inhabit, understand, which ultimately gives him authority over. So that would be my very and that's just theology. Yeah. That's not New Testament. That's theology. I'm like,
well, you get the Jesus half of the Bible, and so whenever we talk about it, I feel like we always have to push you to the side and be like, "This is your area of expertise."
I'm like, wait. You want me to tell you why this matters?
Yeah, I guess the thing that I was trying to get at is that I find it very compelling the stark difference between the two stories, and that one sees an issue and looks to destroy, to which the Bible does have at least some semblances of that idea. But ultimately, the biblical story ends with God taking the form of the creature that is creating havoc and saving them through it.
Yeah. I do also think it's interesting, like when we were talking about, like, why didn't he end the creature's life earlier? And I think about the flood. God said, God repents. Right. It says, this was a very bad idea. Totally wish I hadn't.
My bad, guys.
So we're just going to like wipe the slate clean. We're going to start over. But then God does destroy and then recreates, and then, is still present with that creation. Whereas Victor like creates and then goes on just not only like absent, but then destroying the mate that he promises to create. And he says, I have no repentance for destroying. It was the right thing to do. And I'm like, well, where's your repentance at all of the other terrible things you've done? Like, it's interesting. You won't repent of the thing that like might have actually saved everyone. And yeah. Anyway,
heavy stuff there.
Yeah. And another thing that I also thought was interesting is so many people don't realize that she was a much more prolific writer than just this. And her mother was a hardcore feminist publisher, wrote treatises on the rights of women and reclaiming like women's power in society. Like she comes from like really kind of at the time very radical stock, and she herself was quite socially radical. And here's what I thought was very interesting. Did you pick up how many times she talks about the Native Americans in America?
No.
It was so interesting. Is she was talking about like in the pursuit of something, like not causing harm, like what Victor has done. And she has like a parenthesis where she said, if this had been taken into account, what tragedies might have been spared those inhabitants of the Americas. And I'm just like, I didn't know that anyone in like Switzerland in 1820 was even thinking about or aware that was happening. And I thought that's very interesting to me that the world was much more connected than we believe it to have been. That people were aware on a more global scale, that we like to think, oh, we're living in the global age. I'm like, okay, she is aware of these like contemporary events, and people there are having these ethical conversations about colonialism and about like, genocide. And I'm just like, it was very interesting to me how that was something that kept coming up, was like oppression of certain peoples. That are just so far removed from what her context was, that's kind of why I was thinking, considering how she peppers that throughout the story, I'm like, that's why I think that there is like, maybe, I don't want to say not theological because everything's theological, but that this is a common, a commentary. Thank you. A commentary on human society and how this works, or when it doesn't. And so the creature and creator, and then like the ways that he's denied community or desires it, and then she broadens like this like telescoping out of what's going on in the broader world, if not this.
Yeah. And in that sense, it's supposed to be a cautionary tale throughout. Even the story, like the story's impetus is that Victor is, confronted with that naval group that's going through Antarctica or whatever, and telling him the lengths at which, his crew is going to pursue their glory or whatever. And that's what causes Victor to go on his whole tirade about Frankenstein's or the monster.
Yes.
That's the whole thing. And the story ends, right, with this kind of, dilemma where, Frankenstein's dead and the crew has to decide, like, are we going to keep going or are we going to stop? And there's this kind of impasse that comes.
And I think it's interesting when you said a cautionary tale that the alternate title is The Modern Prometheus.
Yeah.
What happens when you play with fire? What happens when you mess with the things that only God can determine? Or what happens when you just do things without considering and thinking what impact this has on not just the thing in front of you, but these ripples of the interconnectedness of humanity. Like she's talking about things happening to Native Americans like thousands and thousands of miles away, and connecting it to, it's this kind of thinking. It's this kind of being in the world that produces suffering on this massive scale. Which I think is, like I said, I kind of felt like not only did the book age well, but it was really ahead of its time.
Yeah. Oh, it's real scary. That's the scariest part about this.
This could have been written today.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's the beauty of horror, right? Is that most people associate it with, gore or jump scares, like what really gets your heart, palpitating. But the real strength of what horror has to bring in terms of communicating truth is that it tells us what we're afraid of at its root cause. And so monstrosity for us is, at least in Frankenstein, is both what does it mean to create something that goes beyond us, and what kind of ethical responsibility do we have to that creation, but also as a community, what does it mean for us to strive after glory outside of community that might affect that community? How does that turn us into monsters? Like, that's the scariest part.
Yes.
The
truth of
all that to say, ChatGPT is the new Frankenstein's monster.
No, you're right, though. The truth of horror is that it's true. It's for all the demon clowns and vampires, the thing that frightens us is the reality of these things, is underneath. Are human beings capable of creating things that destroy? Yes. Are humans constantly deferring responsibility to their actions? Yes. Like those are the things that, like, we're afraid of them, not just because we're afraid of them, but because they're realities.
Yeah, they're not some abstract idea that's out. It's a real concrete thing that happens.
Yes. Yeah. That's why I'm like, I'm not afraid of like demon clowns. I'm terribly afraid of, that's why for me, like psychological horror movies are like far more disturbing.
Sure.
That I can believe.
Yeah.
I believe that human beings, when like this monster, have been deprived of community and love, and can they do monstrous things? Yes, they can.
Yes.
We see it all the time. We see it on massive scales. and so like you said, maybe it's a cautionary tale, but maybe it's also meant to be like a parable. Where do we locate ourselves in the story? And does that invite us to write another one or another chapter? Kind of like when we receive Jesus's, parable of the Good Samaritan, it's asking us, what do our actions mirror? And it also gives us other options. There are other ways that one can respond. So cautionary, but also invitational.
Right. In that sense, I guess that's where I'm getting at when I mentioned the welcoming of the other, the welcoming of the monster. It's our role as a society, with lack of a better term or approximation, is to bring in those that we have othered in the community, whether they're LGBTQ, whether they're people experiencing homelessness. It doesn't matter, but that is our responsibility, at least as people who don't see ourselves as like moguls who are creating highly advanced, algorithmic, artificially intelligent beings. You know what I mean?
Well, speak for yourself, Sergio. I mean,
we got robots in the back right now.
Yeah, and you're right, because I think that it's easy for us, normal people, and I use that term very loosely, like that I'm not creating like these massive scientific medical or but do we all share this role of creator,
Yeah.
communally and corporately? Like, what are we creating? And that is so much more than any particular innovation or any particular patent. We're talking about, we are all participating in the creation of either a monstrous society or a good one. And
yeah, I'm reminded of, even though it's a bit controversial for some in the film world, Todd Phillips' Joker. There was similar conversation in that the Joker, the titular character, the villain of Batman's universe, many have argued in that film that he is the direct product of the city that he's living in, Gotham City, that they are the ones, and the elected officials and the government that proceeds over it, they are the reason that Joker exists. They are the ones that created him. And in a similar way, like you said, we might not be creating these, what we would understand as like digital, advancements, but we are creating the communities that we are a part of. And in that sense, when we hedge our bets on this kind of tribalistic way of doing community, we are inevitably going to leave people out, and that's who we will demonize and who will inevitably, or hopefully not, become monstrous.
this was the exact argument that I used about gun violence. That
Yeah.
we always want to other. We're like, oh, well, that person who committed that mass shooting, like they were unwell, they were psychologically disturbed. And I'm not saying that those things might not be, like that's also valid. But
Right.
At some point, when we look at the numbers, when we look at the pervasiveness, we have to say this came out of us.
Yeah.
Not out of that one, out of us. There is something in our culture, society, community that is producing that. And we have a responsibility to address it and to also change it. And as long as we continue finding reasons why this one was different and not why they are one of us, we will continue to perpetuate the issue.
Yeah.
So we might as well be in the, Arctic, chasing a, 9-foot tall demon of a man, for as much as we can affect any kind of change, the longer that we other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, well, that's kind of a gloomy, well, I guess it is.
Go figure, the Frankenstein book ends on a.
I also love that was how she wrote it, is that it was in the middle of like days and days of thunderstorms, and they couldn't go outside. And so they were like, all right, I guess, we might as well just write our own stories. And I'm like, isn't this like a real case for boredom? Which, no, seriously, and especially going back to our digital age, like where you never have to be bored. Like, folks, boredom produced this.
That's right. Well, she was in it with a group of friends, right? And they were having a contest. Is that what it was?
Yeah. Because they're like, well, we can't go sailing, which, sad story, her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, died when his sailboat capsized. So I'm like, it's probably for the best that they went sailing. They're like, they can't go picnicking. They can't go cavorting, with the sheep and pastoral settings. So they're like, well, I guess, if we're stuck inside, we might as well just, we're all writers. So let's all just, have a contest and write a story. And I'm like, I just want to say, like, boredom can be such a wonderful thing, because look at what space it creates for But like, I love that you reminded us, yes, in boredom, but also in community.
Mm-hmm.
So
I was gonna say, because Victor, you could argue, is a very bored man who had a lot of thoughts and didn't, springboard it off of anyone.
But they were, but this was what you make when you're bored and in community, and not just running amok on your own. So if anyone is watching, let that be your lesson. Embrace boredom, but also embrace community. Sergio, thank you so much for being here. This has been like the most fun conversation about Frankenstein that I've ever been part of, let alone that I've ever heard. And friends, thank you so much. We will be returning to our regularly scheduled programming next month, where we look at theological books, books about religion and faith written by the Candler community. And I'd like to invite you to our next webinar, which will be September 9th at 12 p.m., where I will be meeting with Dr. Jennifer Quigley, and her book she's edited called Assembling Futures: Economy, Ecology, Democracy, and Religion. And folks, if that isn't a timely set of topics, I don't know what is. So thank you for being here. Remain well, and we'll see you back here next month.